Welcome to the Bridgehead with Stephanie Gray and Jonathon Van Maren, bringing you cutting-edge news, commentary, and interviews from the front lines of the culture wars.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Bridgehead on AM 530 at 1:30 p.m. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and I'll be your host for the next half an hour. Now, what I'd like to take a look with you today is I've gone over pornography and rape culture and a lot of these really significant human rights issues over the last couple of months. But today I want to take a look back into history at how this whole porn movement was really brought to us. And for those of you who are interested in history, most of you have heard of a man named Dr. Alfred Kinsey. In 1948, he wrote a book called Sexuality and the Human Male. In 1953, he wrote a book called Sexuality and the Human Female. And in these books, he revealed such cataclysmic things that nobody had ever known, that it completely changed the way they viewed sex in the United States, and it launched the sexual revolution, which would, of course, have a global impact. Just to give you an example, a few examples of things that Alfred Kinsey revealed in these books. He said that 30 to 45% of men had affairs, 85% of men had sex prior to marriage, 70% of men had slept with prostitutes, and that between 10 and 37% of men had engaged in homosexual behavior. In fact, one of my professors at university, when I first began taking history classes, told the class that the sexual revolution hadn't actually happened because Kinsey's data proved that people had been doing all this type of thing all along. And that was the prevailing conventional wisdom for quite some time, that Kinsey revealed, to a shocked population that they'd all been doing all of these things all along, and that thus having such laws, it didn't make sense, and that furthermore made no sense in the context of what was already going on. But was Alfred Kinsey right, or was he wrong? Now, a woman named Dr. Judith Reisman started to take a look into Dr. Kinsey's work. She's an American conservative academic and author, and she's best known for her criticism and condemnation of the work and legacy of Alfred Kinsey, which, as she tells me, she stumbled onto sort of by accident. But she's actually been referred to as the founder of the modern anti-Kinsey movement, which I think, once you take a look at the things that she exposes Kinsey to be, is really just people who are taking an honest look at the historical data behind Alfred Kinsey and behind Alfred Kinsey's team and behind the data that they produced, or some would say unleashed on the American public. So if you want to take a look at some of the work that she does, go to www.drjudithreisman.com or go to stopthekinseyinstitute.org. She's written a number of books, Kinsey, Crime and Consequences, Kinsey, Sex and Fraud, and Soft Porn Plays Hardball. She's considered a top expert in human sexuality in many different areas, and her work on Dr. Kinsey and on the sexual revolution has been nothing short of groundbreaking. So without further ado, I would like to present to you a conversation with Dr. Judith Reisman.
Start off with my opening question. Could you just tell our listeners a bit about the man who was Alfred Kinsey? He's been the subject of a Hollywood movie. He's common fare in university history classes. He certainly was in my first-year history class. Who was Alfred Kinsey? Why is he important?
Well, he was a sexual psychopath, we can start with that, who dedicated himself really to creating an environment that would legalize everything that he was engaged in doing himself. And it's fascinating that the history books are so careful to clean up his entire body of work based on the fact that they claim that he was a sort of, a conservative kind of Republican bow tie guy.
Right.
I've been trying for a long time to correct the scientific history because it's very important to get our science history straight. So, he was a bi-homosexual. There's argument whether he was homosexual or bi-homosexual. He had children, so let's qualify that as a bi-homosexual. He sexually was involved in the sexual solicitation and location and abuse of at least 317, more likely 2,035 children, infants and children. And so he was a sadomasochist, and all this is in bits and pieces. You find it in even the biographies of his history, his own people. And he chaired, or really was responsible for, the global sexual revolution. That's who he was.
So this influence obviously was somewhat based on wishful thinking when he declared that everybody was sort of engaging in whatever sexual behavior they wanted to. People liked the idea of a world that looked like that and therefore sort of endorsed his thesis. But how did it manage to take off to such a degree? The first book was written, I believe, in 1948, Sexuality of the Human Male, and the second one was written in 1953. And then somehow things just sort of exploded from there.
Yeah, well, they exploded really before 1948. I mean, this was a design, and it was paid for, and it fulfilled the interests, however you want to put that, of the Rockefeller Foundation. They were fully supportive of Kinsey, and they knew full well at a certain point before he released his so-called data, they knew quite well that these data were completely false. One of their own people objected strenuously to. As a matter of fact, it was I don't remember his name now. It's in my book. He was in charge of their historical records and so on, and the science of it. And he said, this man claims things that are absolutely invalid. He said that he has no statistician. He has no statistician.
Right.
And he doesn't know the difference between, a population, quote unquote, of 2 and one of 3,000. This is incredible. And he objected strenuously to the fact that the Rockefellers continued to support Kinsey's research, but he was simply promoted up and out and quietly abandoned any objections. So there's no question that Kinsey was really, in a way, just a shill. He was a small-time guy, a zoologist. Come on, his specialty was gall wasps.
Right.
Give me a break. And so they selected him for this kind of research, and he fulfilled their needs.
You reveal in your book that Kinsey did a lot of things that the public wouldn't be aware of, like shooting illegal porn movies in his attic. We have most of him and his colleagues being in what you referred to as front marriages, where essentially they were doing whatever they want while having a marriage to sort of maintain that aura of respectability. Do you think that the American public at the time this was happening especially would have been shocked if they knew what Alfred Kinsey and his colleagues were actually all about?
Oh, good gracious, yes. They would have been absolutely appalled. The public would have insisted that he be arrested, and all of them, and answer to the authorities. They would have been stunned, and that is the reason that it was such a secret. He kept everything hidden. He insisted his people wear suits all the time and keep their hair cut and short. He refused to allow beards. There was one guy Gebhardt, who could sport a mustache, but that was it. I mean, no, he was very rigorous in the control of these men, and they only would be allowed to serve with him if they had these terrible secrets in their past and or present, because he absolutely required control and censorship of everything.
If Kinsey was such sort of a transparent shill, and if you take a look at his data, both the research you've done and several others has proven that Alfred Kinsey junked 3/4 of his data. Essentially, he already had a conclusion in mind. He was just looking for the data to back it, much like his fellow sexual revolutionary Margaret Mead a few decades earlier with Coming of Age in Samoa. They had conclusions that they needed to reach, and they simply went out and looked for the data to fill in the blanks. But to this day, there are scientists who say, look, if you sort of exclude some of Kinsey's more outlier interviews like prostitutes and prisoners, you still end up with the same results, and they still defend Kinsey. Why is it that so many so-called intelligent academics are willing to defend Kinsey and his work in spite of the overwhelming evidence that, he was a paid hack with a personal sexual agenda?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of things involved in that. One of them, sort of mundane, is grants. The Rockefeller Foundation is very influential, and they give grants as well as the mainstream granting organizations. People who whistleblow, really I suppose I'm kind of a whistleblower. Anyone who will, point out the truth about the complete fraud involved will simply not get money and not get positions and not be promoted and not get their papers published and that sort of thing. Kuhn, when he wrote his work on the paradigm shifts, pointed out that that kind of thing is protected. His findings, quote unquote, were protected. I was amazed when I found the tables on the children. I thought, oh, good gracious, this is impossible. And so I sent the tables, copies of the tables, to the Hastings Institute on Ethics and Public Policy at the time or something like that.
Right.
And I thought, oh, good, great, here you are. Look, I attached the tables and a note, and I thought that would be the end of it, and I'd go on to other work. Yeah. And I was stunned that there was so much reticence. People refused to, to do anything or believe in any way. I got a note back from them saying that they thought they resented my tone.
Really?
So, yeah. They said something about hysterical tone. I didn't think it was hysterical. I just sent the charts and the graphs and expected that they would do something. So that started me looking. I wrote to other scientists, people I thought I knew, and I said, included the charts, and I always got back. I remember I wrote to Pauling.
Right.
Linus Pauling. And I just assumed that they would be aware that a man who would involve himself in saying that the sexual torture of a 2-month-old for orgasm was not a trustworthy scientist. Does that take a great deal of knowledge and what does that involve?
It really doesn't seem like it does, no.
Then I was forced to go back and look at all the rest of his work very thoroughly, and my goodness, this is a man who forced answers that he wanted from his subjects. I mean, that's in his own writing. Who changed the answers? That's in his own writing. That's in his book. And how you can begin to say that kind of thing is good methodology? I'm sorry, it simply can't hold up. And I know recently, Richard Posner, Judge Posner,
right?
Yeah, he made very clear how to put his language, arrogant statements about marriage and heterosexuality and so on. Well, Judge Posner has been one of the major promoters of Kinsey's work. He was constantly citing Kinsey.
You said
and his
that Alfred
findings.
Kinsey has had tremendous impact on sex education, on law, on politics, all those types of things. Could you give us just a few examples of the impact Kinsey has had in, today in 2014?
Oh, goodness, yes. The Kinsey Institute has a website. It's called Kinsey Reporter. It's an app for the phone.
Right.
And this will normalize everything. And they did this carefully. It was already, they had a conference about a year and a half ago, which I got the information from, that the special guest was a guy who promised them that he could create a website that would make it completely anonymous so that they could report anything that they wanted to. And you're talking about, we're living in an epidemic of child sexual abuse,
right,
child prostitution, child trafficking, and child pornography, and you're able to write in anything that you do or others do and no one can track it? So that means that these guys are being encouraged, solicited, encouraged to report. You think, what do they have, a whole gangs of pedophiles? Good gracious, report everything in. That they are called citizen scientists. If that isn't a global impact, I don't know what is. And of course, the Kinsey Institute's now part of the UN. It has consultative status with the ECOSAC, and they will be there to direct all of the world, about sexuality. Now, that's very important, because if we get everybody in the world, I mean, not everybody, but, as we sexually corrupt, as we've done with sex education and so on, but en masse, who is going to run the world? Who is going to run the governments? Who's going to be your doctors, your lawyers, who has not been impacted by this kind of corruption? It's really mind-boggling.
When you take a look at, and you talk about this a lot, you've given lectures on this, you've written many, many different works on this. What are the one or two things that really shock people about Alfred Kinsey? Like, I remember hearing about Alfred Kinsey in my first-year American history class when I got to university, and the professor sort of made this, what he thought was a profound pronouncement that the sexual revolution had never happened. And his evidence for this was Alfred Kinsey, because Alfred Kinsey had proven that everyone was a pervert long before Alfred Kinsey's data came out.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, what are the... Yeah. And none of this information... I didn't think much of it at the time. I wasn't really particularly interested in Alfred Kinsey, so I don't remember, thinking one thing firmly either way. But when I started taking a look into it, like the stuff that you had written, especially shocked me. What's the one thing you find shocks people the most and stands out to them the most?
Well, of course, what he did to the children
does,
and the children's responses, which he, absolutely recorded, that they were fainting and screaming and having convulsions, and he concluded that meant those were orgasms. And when I read it, I said, oh my gosh, the guy's a sadomasochistic pedophile.
Right.
But, so that, of course. But the other thing is, what you point out, people who are not, I'm 79, so I can remember life before Kinsey.
Right.
And I know that I think perhaps the most offensive thing to me has been the libeling of the greatest generation, the libel and the slander.
Right.
The people that won World War II, that sacrificed their lives, the people abroad, the people at home, the Americans who worked, long shifts to provide the ammo at home and the weaponry, and the guys out there out in the field who were defending our country were libeled and slandered by draft dodgers. His whole crew were draft dodgers.
Right.
They, so that's pretty shocking. And when you think that you built an entire, quote, sexual revolution on this body of lies. But the other thing would be the fact that he relied on a Nazi pedophile for so much of his data. That's pretty shocking to people.
What made you look into this topic in the first place? Like, what led you to really start taking a look at Kinsey and kind of peeling the onion a bit on his methodology and what he had come up with?
Well, it was Playboy.
Right.
Yeah, it was Playboy. My daughter was at 10 years of age. She was raped by the boy upstairs who had his father's Playboys, and he said to her, he said, when she objected, he said he knew better because he read it in his father's Playboys, and so I didn't know anything about Kinsey. I mean, I knew about Kinsey, heard about him, but then I read, Playboy Hefner would be Kinsey's pamphleteer. He said,
right.
He read Kinsey, and he would be Kinsey's pamphleteer, and that led me to Kinsey. I said, I wonder if this is reflected in the magazine. And indeed it was. The children, the child cartoons, the child pictures, the child photographs were definitely, and all the rest of the sexual revolution carried forward were reflected in Playboy. So one thing led to another.
And I know you mentioned this in your email as well, but what can our listeners do about this? Like, Kinsey wrote his books in 1948 and 1953. It kind of seems like the sexual revolution, happened and is here to stay. But what would you say we can still do to oppose the legacy of Kinsey in a public and effective way?
Well, I think we have to look around us. The fact is that this revolution has caused more trouble than we could ever have dreamt of. The AIDS, the VD, the kids, child sexual abuse, every measure.
And if you
include
abortion in that, I've always said that the sexual revolution has a higher kill count than any other revolution.
Oh
in
yeah,
history.
oh yeah, of course it does. And all this added up, and not only that, but we could go on and on. The men are now reporting in with this no FAP. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I have. I believe it's men banding together and agreeing not to avoid masturbation.
7,000 guys have written in about the way they are not virile anymore. They're young men who are impotent. So the cost is to us with all these changes has been enormous. So we are really we're bound to try to do something about it. And the first thing is to get this information out about the basis of the sexual revolution. A sexual psychopath, a man, a rapist of children, and then the ECOSAC thing causes us to have a great opportunity. The website, I think I gave it to you, did I?
Yeah, StopTheKinseyInstitute.org.
Yeah, joining that, beginning to add up those signatures, let them pile up the signatures, and beginning to awareness, wake up and smell the coffee. Not only that, but on my website, go to my website. There's an ALEC report, American Legislative Exchange Council, and they did a report which told all the states should start investigating. The states should investigate your sex education that's in the classroom. It's all based on Kinsey, So there are enormous amounts of things that could be done, and the main thing would be to investigate and expose. Investigate and expose, investigate and expose, and start correcting the history. That will allow us to get involved in the lawsuits that we need to get involved in. It will allow us to start pushing for the legislation that should be pushed for, to push back on the bullying legislation, to push back on all of this so-called homosexual youth when children are being recruited into this activity. there's a lot that can be done once the people know.
Right. So investigate and expose. Dr. Judith Reisman, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Dr. Judith Reisman of Liberty University in Virginia, the USA, talking about Dr. Alfred Kinsey and the impact the Kinsey Reports had on the United States and the truth behind those Kinsey Reports. We hope that you all felt a bit enlightened by this interview, and we hope that you'll join us again next week. Thanks for listening, and have a great weekend.